Hello, my name is Mark Davis. I am a professor of biology at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, USA. The title of my presentation is Defining Nature in a Globalizing World, Nativism versus Ecological Novelty. Defining nature is no frivolous task. Whoever defines nature essentially defines how nature is managed. For example, if nature is defined as wilderness, then management will focus on protecting nature from human intervention. If nature is defined as biodiversity, then the focus of management will be on the preservation of species. Today I'm going to talk about two very different paradigms that are competing to define nature: nativism and ecological novelty. I will take up nativism first. Nativism is defined as the policy of protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. We can see examples of nativism around the world today, including in our own countries, where groups of people are trying to tighten borders and prevent the immigration of people from other parts of the world. Nativism can also be applied to plants and animals, where there is a preference for and protection of native species, while efforts are often made to eradicate non-natives. These non-natives can be introduced unintentionally, for example, among shipping products or ballast water. They can be introduced intentionally, such as a food plant or biocontrol organism, and they can be introduced as domesticated organisms, for example, horticultural plants, which then escape from domestication and become feral. With respect to plants and animals, a nativism viewpoint came to dominate conservation in the early 1980s, when the field of invasion biology emerged. At that time, non-natives were characterized using very pejorative language such as invader, alien, exotic, and biological pollution. In addition, the field adopted militaristic metaphors to describe the new species, and war was often declared on the species. Also of significance is that the term invader was used to describe any taxon entering a territory in which it had never occurred before. No distinction was made between harmful and benign species. All natives were deemed to be invaders. More evidence that invasion biology adopted a nativism paradigm is that virtually the sole focus of the field was on negative effects of non-native species. This despite the fact that most non-natives are relatively benign in their impact, and many non-natives produce effects that humans would describe as beneficial. Invasion biology shaped two additional fields that also emerged in the 1980s: restoration ecology and conservation biology. I often think of invasion biology, restoration ecology, and conservation biology as the three sisters, since they all emerged at about the same time. Invasion biology provided restoration ecology and conservation biology the guiding paradigm of nativism. Restoration ecology emerged as an effort to restore, to return habitats back to an earlier state, in particular one that did not include non-native species. In 1994, the Society of Ecological Restoration declared that, quote, ideally a restoration project should consist entirely of indigenous species. This nativism perspective dominated into the 2000s when the Society urged that the control of exotic species should be an integral component of all restoration projects and programs. There is no nuance in restoration ecology's objectives. Non-natives must go. Conservation biology also adopted the nativism paradigm in defining conservation goals. In 1990, the conservation biologist Stanley Temple starkly stated in the journal Conservation Biology, conservation biologists should be as proficient at eradicating exotic species as they are at saving endangered species. No mincing of words by Professor Temple. Again, Temple did not distinguish between non-natives causing problems and those that were not. All exotic species must go. The desire to restore the past and to rid oneself of newcomers is a common human response to very rapid change. Rapid change, whether cultural, political, or ecological, threatens to transform the landscape, threatening the persistence of traditional norms, whether they be practices, beliefs, or ecosystems. In the early 2000s, humanist Svetlana Boym wrote a book on how people respond to rapid changes. According to Boym, rapid change commonly elicits strong feelings of nostalgia. In her book, The Future of Nostalgia, she argued that people tend to adopt one of two types of nostalgia when confronted with rapid change. The first she called restorative nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia, Boym said, knows two main plots: the return to origins and the conspiracy that home is forever under siege, requiring defense against the common enemy. In other words, this is a longing to return to the native state, to the way things used to be. Rapid change brings with it considerable anxiety since it is not clear where the rapid change will lead. The past is reassuring in its familiarity. The longing to return to the past is accompanied by the belief that the rapid change is due to the presence of newcomers who are responsible for the rapid change. They are viewed as those responsible for polluting the purity of the past and of tradition. Under restorative nostalgia, when confronted by this threat, efforts must be undertaken to rid the homeland of the invader, to eradicate them. Boym described the second type of nostalgia as reflective nostalgia. Under rapid change, reflective nostalgia recognizes the sense of loss of the past, but is not hell-bent on restoring the past and branding the newcomers as the enemy and declaring war on them. Rather, reflective nostalgia remembers the past and creatively tries to develop a way forward that integrates aspects of the past with the current changes to create a path to a secure and meaningful future. Restorative nostalgia takes itself dead seriously. There is no irony or humor in the battle against the invaders. Reflective nostalgia, on the other hand, is flexible in its planning and execution. It can even embrace irony and humor. So, how should one respond to the rapid spread and redistribution of species throughout the world? Well, it depends on which of Boym's nostalgic narratives one has adopted. This flyer is a classic example of action arising out of restorative nostalgia. War is declared against one of the world's most evil weeds, which is devouring the landscape. What must be done? According to the flyer, we must band together to fight this menace. With its overt militaristic language, this flyer verges on being a parody of invasion biology and restorative nostalgia, with its references to the enemy, our army, battle plans, and tactics. Here's another example of restorative nostalgia in action. And another. Okay, what is the current situation in ecology? What are the current dynamics in the discipline? Tension. There is a lot of tension because there is intense competition going on to define nature. In response to the ongoing nativism paradigm, which has provided one definition of nature, the dichotomous presence of native and non-native species, there are ongoing new efforts to retire the whole invader narrative and the active promotion of an alternative perspective. There is emphasis on the value of taking a more pragmatic, nuanced, and flexible approach. This alternative approach is emphasis on the idea of ecological novelty. Ecological novelty refers to the fact that due to many types of rapid global change, such as climate change, introductions of new species, and habitat change, novel ecosystems are being created. These are ecosystems that are different from prior ecosystems. For example, due to the mixture of species inhabiting it, the new climate that the ecosystem is experiencing, and/or to habitat change caused by humans. These ecosystems do not have an analog from the past. They are new. One distinct difference between the ecological novelty paradigm and the nativism paradigm is the language used by each. Whereas the nativism paradigm commonly uses very normative language, the ecological novelty paradigm's language is just descriptive. The term ecological novelty simply states that conditions are new. It makes no comment on whether the novelty is good or bad, desirable or undesirable. This is in contrast to the term nativism, which bluntly affirms that native residents are good and that the immigrants, the newcomers, are bad. With respect to species introductions, supporters of ecological novelty argue that new species should not be judged primarily on whether they are native or non-native. In a 2011 essay in the journal Nature, I and 18 other ecologists argued that it is time for conservationists to focus much more on the functions of species and much less on where they originated. The paradigm of ecological novelty is particularly relevant to the ecological changes occurring in cities. While cities are increasingly inhabited by human residents of mixed origins, they are also increasingly inhabited by plants and animals of mixed origins. The long-term plant and animal residents are mostly native species, while the newcomers consist of both non-native and native species. Shown here are immigrant plants and animals common in cities in the upper Midwest of the United States. These include plants such as mullein, red clover, and Queen Anne's lace, and birds such as starlings and house sparrows. Interestingly, many of the new animals in Midwest cities are native. In other words, they used to live primarily in more rural areas around the cities, but over time have become adapted to urban life. In St. Paul, Minnesota, commonly seen new animals include coyotes, red foxes, bald eagles, peregrine falcons, and deer. Ecologist David Maddox runs a website called The Nature of Cities. He asks, in changing urban spaces full of novel ecosystems and natural assemblages, is native purity even a viable option? Two other prominent urban ecologists, Peter Del Tredici and Richard Foreman, have weighed in on the issue of non-native species in urban areas. Illustrating the more pragmatic approach of ecological novelty, Del Tredici observes, in the absence of intensive horticultural maintenance, spontaneous vegetation, consisting of species of mixed origin, will eventually come to dominate most urban landscapes. In other words, you might not like it, but this is the new world. Urban ecosystems inhabited by species of mixed origin, some native and some non-native. Richard Foreman notes the benefits provided by non-native plants. He says, in urban areas, most native plant species cannot keep up with the rate of environmental changes, so a continual reign of new non-native species helps keep the city green. Del Tredici also notes that in an urban context, the concept of restoration is really just gardening dressed up to look like ecology. And Foreman, commenting on the futility of trying to turn the clock back to fully native ecosystems, points out that pulling out non-native plants near a massive mother source of dispersing seeds, areas covered by non-natives, seems analogous to using a fly swatter among billions of mosquitoes, or tilting with windmills a la Don Quixote. Non-native plants and animals are now integral parts of our cities. One really has only two options, learn to love them, or at least learn to live with them. They're not going back to their homelands. They are now part of our urban floras and faunas. In the field of landscape architecture, Germany is a leader in recognizing the reality of ecological novelty. In Berlin, an abandoned railway was converted into a park. The effort clearly was undertaken under the ecological novelty perspective and not the nativism paradigm. Non-native species that had colonized the area were not eradicated, but actually incorporated into the park. Commenting on the railway park, Foreman said, this mixed origin woodland is altogether distinctive, displaying an extremely high plant diversity composed of a rich and unique mixture of native urban plants and non-native species. that non-native species can actually contribute to high biodiversity is something not commonly recognized. Does accepting non-natives mean turning one's back on history and a sense of place? History is certainly context. The present unquestionably arose from the past. But history is not a directive. There is no ecological imperative that states that we are obligated to try to recreate or restore the past. Restoration and conservation goals are management decisions, and those decisions are likely to differ dramatically depending upon whether one is operating under the nativism paradigm or the ecological novelty perspective. One argument to eradicate non-native species and restore native species is that the native species provide a sense of place. But non-natives sometimes also provide a sense of place. Shown here are pictures of red clover and lilac, both non-native species in the United States. It turns out they are both state flowers. Vermonters selected red clover as their state flower, and New Hampshireites chose lilac as theirs. The fact is, both species have been in New England for probably hundreds of years. They were already abundant when everyone who is now alive was born. The two common non-native species certainly do contribute to a sense of place for the residents of these two states. The honeybee is a non-native insect, but residents of Arkansas selected it as their non-native species. In fact, nearly a third of the states in the United States have declared it their state insect, again showing that non-native species can indeed contribute to a sense of place. Mount Sutro Forest, a park in San Francisco, is another example of non-native species providing a sense of place. About 100 years ago, eucalyptus trees were planted at the site, and they now represent one of the dominant tree species in the park. Beginning about 2010, a group of restorationists environmentalists began an effort to try to nativize the park. They wanted to get rid of as many non-native species as possible. This would have involved cutting down a large portion of the eucalyptus trees and using lots of chemical applications to get rid of non-native ground and shrub vegetation. The proposal of this plan resulted in a large and very strong pushback from many citizens, including many who used the park regularly. Since the eucalyptus trees had been there since the citizens were born, the trees provided a strong sense of place to the forest park. In addition, the trees provided habitat for many bird and other animal species. The citizens objected strongly to the eucalyptus eradication plan. In the end, a much reduced restoration effort was implemented. Unfortunately, although not surprisingly, there has been intense resistance to this more flexible perspective. This has consisted of persistent efforts to shore up and perpetuate past approaches and perspectives, and continued emphasis on the primacy of geographic identity, origins, borders, homeland, and heritage. It's not really surprising that there is considerable opposition to the ecological novelty paradigm. The nativism paradigm has dominated the fields of invasion biology, restoration ecology, and conservation biology for several decades. Many individuals and groups of people are heavily invested in supporting the nativism paradigm. For example, chemical and restoration companies benefit from efforts to eradicate non-native species. If non-native species are no longer viewed as inherent villains, there will be fewer eradication efforts and less work for these companies. Conservation organizations also can benefit from the nativism paradigm. They can use claims of alien species driving out native species as a way to gain support for their organizations. There are agencies at all civic levels, federal, state, county, and city, which have as their focus the management of invasive species. Moreover, all of these companies and agencies have employees, and the jobs of many likely would be at stake if the more flexible ecological novelty paradigm replaced the nativism one. Finally, there are academic researchers who have benefited from the nativism paradigm. Emphasizing the dire threat posed by non-native species has enabled many researchers to secure grant funding and to receive attention in their fields and from the general public. and the academic identity of many researchers has been as an invasion biologist. So, how should conservationists respond to ecological novelty? One option is to deny the value of the ecological novelty paradigm and to hold fast to the nativism paradigm that arose in the 80s and 90s. Many conservationists and restorationists have continued to embrace this option. Another is to take a deep breath and think less about origins and focus much more on ecological functions. This is a 21st century perspective, whereas the nativism paradigm is more of a 20th century perspective. Another option still is to utilize ecological novelty as inspiration to think of 21st centuries in novel ways. There is no question that ecological novelty presents new challenges to conservationists. But as I said, it also presents some opportunities. If one is flexible in mind, one can use novel ecology as a springboard for novel thinking in the fields of restoration ecology and conservation biology. Restoration and conservation efforts need not continue to proceed as they have in the past, with their focus on promoting native species and reducing non-natives. So, the nativism paradigm and the ecological novelty paradigm are engaged in passionate competition to define nature. Nativism essentially had the field to itself from 1980 to 2000. Nativism was the presumed paradigm in restoration ecology and conservation biology in the 80s and 90s. It was the starting point. It was essentially axiomatic and hardly ever questioned. Criticism of the nativism paradigm began around 2000. During the 2000s, a small group of philosophers of science, historians of science, sociologists, and ecologists began to criticize the nativism paradigm for its use of normative language and its dichotomous portrayal of nature. Today, I would say that the nativism paradigm still remains the dominant organizing theme of restoration ecology and conservation biology, but limitations of the nativism paradigm are being increasingly recognized, and support for ecological novelty continues to rise. It is impossible to say when ecological novelty will supersede nativism as the guiding paradigm for conservation, but I believe it is inevitable. It is difficult to imagine that by the middle of the century, ecologists will still be so preoccupied with the origins of plants and animals. And most of those who developed the field of invasion biology will have been replaced by younger people who grew up in the rapidly globalizing world. For those coming of age now, globalization of both people and other organisms is the new normal. Origins are less of an issue. For the younger people, nativism with respect to plants and animals will seem less relevant, perhaps quaintly old-fashioned. Much more relevant will be the emphasis on ecological novelty. It is more pragmatic and flexible, and ultimately, as an underlying paradigm, ecological novelty represents much better science than nativism. I would like to end my presentation with a final thought. All the rocky planets in the universe have a geology. However, currently, Earth is the only planet we know of with an ecology, life as well as rocks. In this context, the desire and practice of declaring some species as aliens, exotics, or invaders seems sadly provincial and even unseemly. Roman playwright Terence wrote, "I am human, and nothing of that which is human is alien to me." To those who still see value in calling out some species as alien, I say, I am of the planet Earth, and nothing of that which is earthly is alien to me. Thank you for listening.